A warm welcome to this pre-conference talk about feminist political ecology and the economics of care with Wendy Harcourt. Bienvenidos a esta conferencia magistral pre-congreso, bienvenidas, bienvenides, intitulada Ecología, política feminista y economía del cuidado con Wendy Harcourt. This will be a bilingual event in English and Spanish, and I would like to invite all of you to choose your preferred language channel through the language button at the bottom right of your screen. I take the opportunity to thank in advance our simultaneous interpreter, Heather Hayes, and also the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and my colleagues from Universidad Andina for making this gathering possible today. My name is Miriam Lang, and I'm part of the area of environment and sustainability at Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar here in Quito, where I coordinate the Masters in Political Ecology and Alternatives to Development, and I will moderate this session. It is my great pleasure to introduce Wendy Harcourt to all of you. She's Professor of Gender, Diversity and Sustainable Development at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University Rotterdam in The Hague. Wendy has been full professor at the ISS since October 2017. She coordinates the Marie Curie Innovative Training Network's WeGo, Well-Being, Ecology, Gender and Community, that is what it stands for, which was awarded by the EU in May 2017. Wendy joined the ISS in November 2011 after 20 years at the Society for International Development in Rome, where she worked as editor of the journal Development and as director of programs. Today, she is a series editor of the Palgrave Gender, Development and Social Change series and the ISS Routledge series on gender development and sexuality. Wendy has published widely in the fields of feminist political ecology, gender and development, and also in critical development studies. Her monograph, Body Politics in Development, published by Z Books in London, won the Feminist Studies and Women's Association Prize in 2010. One of her books, which she co-edited together with Christine Bauhart, has a title almost identical to today's conference. It's entitled Feminist Political Ecology and the Economics of Care in Search of Economic Alternatives. Welcome, Wendy. Thanks for sharing this space with us today. Wendy will actually talk to us here in Ecuador from the future, so to say, as she's currently in Australia and it is early Friday morning there already. So thanks so much for getting up for us. Actually, this is the first of a variety of pre-conference events which paved the way toward the 21st yearly conference of the International Association of Feminist Economics, with the overall theme, Sustaining Life, Challenges of Multidimensional Crises. It will be held, the conference, between the 22nd and 25th of June next week, and you can still register for free at www.iaffe.org if you have not done so yet. We have planned this conversation for over a year now, as in 2020, the International Association of Feminist Economics conference should already have taken place here in Quito in the Ecuadorian Andes, but it then had to be cancelled and postponed due to the pandemic, and unfortunately, we still can only meet virtually this day. So what is our starting point for today's reflection? In the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, human societies face a situation in which the multidimensional crises could not be more evident. Some of us even speak of a civilizational crisis, as we believe that some of the very foundations of Western capitalist colonial civilization have brought us to this point. As the call for the IAFFE conference next week points out, our economic and political systems are failing to address the necessity to sustain and reproduce life as such in its human and non-human diversity. Instead, they lead to an ongoing increase in inequality, tensions around race, ethnicity, religion, gender, all kinds of violence and discrimination, natural disasters, loss of species, and also of authoritarianism in the realm of politics. Specifically here in Latin America, the pandemic has plunged all countries into a severe recession and has expelled hundreds of thousands from formal employment, expanding what we call the informal economy even further. Confinement measures have been decreed by governments, simply ignoring the imperative necessity for thousands of women and men to leave their homes daily to make their living in this formal economy in an utterly disrespectful and violent way. At the same time, we have seen many networks of solidarity emerge. We have seen peasants coming to the city with truckloads of fresh produce, which they then gave out in popular neighborhoods. The pandemic also exposed the extreme precarity of public healthcare systems in this part of the world, which has been the most severely hit by COVID-19 deaths. It has exacerbated inequalities and gender violence, as well as the care burdens shouldered mostly by women. It has made clear that the aggressive deforestation and subsequent cornering of wild species that our dominant agri-food systems require causes this kind of diseases and threatens us all. And of course, it made evident the huge importance that care in all its dimensions has for good life. As you said, Wendy, caring for climate, caring for earth, and caring for people should be at the center of economic value and not at the margins. Unfortunately, at least in this part of the world, governments' ideas on how to recover from this situation are just more of the same that has brought us here. Reactivate economic growth, mainly by expanding and deepening extractivism. This is why we consider that innovative feminist thought on how to reframe, to redefine, and also to practically reorganize economics, as well as our societal relations with each other and with nature, are more necessary than ever. And it is in this sense, of course, Wendy, that we have invited you to share your search for alternatives around an economics of care, which draws on feminist political ecology with this audience today. So thanks again very much for accepting this invitation. We are thrilled to have you. And just a little note, I would like to encourage all of you to post your comments or questions in the Zoom chat in writing from the very beginning, whenever they occur to you. We have plenty of time to come back to them after Wendy's talk, and the dynamic will be that you interact in writing and Wendy responds. Wendy, the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, Miriam, for that wonderful introduction. And it's very promising, I hope, for the kind of dialogues that we can have here and in the future. As you say, these are moments of crisis, but they're also, I think, moments of hope if we can have these kinds of dialogues. Strangely, also having them in this way through Zoom, in some senses, it allows us to connect in ways we couldn't do before. So some of what I have to say is not only about crisis, but also about how we can build on radical hope. That would be what I would like to do. I'm going to share my screen just so that you have something to look at as I speak, rather than just me. And okay. So First of all, I want to acknowledge where I'm speaking from. It's true that we're all connected through the internet, but I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Ora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. The Gadigal of the Ora Nation are the traditional custodians of the place we now call Sydney. I am starting with that because I'm here, but it's also part of my way of relearning and rethinking about how we can care for the earth and how we can care for other beings. Because as Miriam pointed out, I think that our Western Eurocentric ways of understanding care and understanding country and understanding relations, we need to be learning from non-Western knowledge systems. And this is a painful process because it also acknowledges the pain of the past. So in my talk, I am going to be trying to talk with you about things I'm thinking through myself. I'm here because I am caring for my father, who is transitioning at this moment. He's turning 90 next week. He's very ill. It's also a time for me. I've been here during the time of COVID. I've been in a quarantine hotel. These are all moments which allow me to pause and reflect and think with, if you like, my senses and my being really challenged because of COVID and because of thinking through transitions of life, and also acknowledging that my own country, as a white settler Australian, has many things to think about. COVID has not hit Australia in the same way, but still it's really made me, and I think many others, rethink about how we have to care for the earth and for country. So basically, I am, as Miriam has already said, asking us to focus on how care work, which is always there, what actually needs to change in this moment, if you like, of crisis, but perhaps also in this moment of hope, is that it's no longer invisible, it's no longer privatized, and it's no longer done for free by women, people of color, immigrants, or other marginalized groups. For me, this notion of caring for the environment or caring for Earth is about caring for all peoples and more than human others. And this is what should be at the center of economic value, something that is at the moment very much at the margins. So what I'm going to do is take us through, or at least take us through my way of understanding different notions of care from a feminist political ecology perspective. Learning from feminist economics, learning specifically from feminist degrowth. And that's why I was very excited that Miriam invited me to speak with you and with her here, because I've been following her work on feminist degrowth. And also with humility from decolonial feminism. This is something that I'm really needing to think through and work through in a form of allyship with decolonial feminists. Because I think all of these approaches, these different feminisms, really allow us to profoundly challenge the neoliberal capitalist focus on growth, the free market, technological efficiency, and to address the fact that they pay very inadequate lip service to the notion of gender and empowerment and inclusion, all terms that we use, but all terms that are not being heard or incorporated into mainstream economies, which continue to ignore power relations, inequalities based on gender, race, ethnicity, class, physical ability, and most of all, and this is what is at the heart of my talk, ignoring the multiple forms of care work that are required to maintain the everyday life, both human and more than human, in all of our societies. Now, I'm only exploring these ideas with you. I think many of us have been thinking these things through, writing about them, acting them, observing them. As Miriam said, the truckloads from the peasants of food coming in the moment of crisis. There are many, many examples of how we are already valuing care. But my idea here is to say that I think we need to take this much more strongly, challenge much more the mainstream invisibility of care work, and really call for this care revolution, which the feminist degrowth movement in particular is calling for, and see what we really mean by a good life. not just to pay lip service to it, but to try to think how we can place care at the core of a degrowth social critical analysis and our political action. And for me, that's been about learning and listening to the many different forms of feminisms, which I think all of us, if we hear at a pre-conference for IAFFE, have been thinking through and acting in these last decades. It's time that we've been doing it. I'm not trying to say that there's sort of a call for revolution that's going to really change our ways of doing, but I think we have to really come together in solidarity to do it at this moment, because as Arundhati Roy in her very famous statement, which circulated at the beginning at the first wave of COVID, really talked about how a portal can open up ways that we can really, in a deep way, challenge white, patriarchal and colonial economic thinking. So I'll be doing that by, I'll be doing this by discussing feminist foundations in 4 ways. First of all, I'll be talking about feminist foundations. Then I'll be looking at meanings of care. And then I'll be looking at how you consent to care. And then really listening to the pluriversal. So from where I'm speaking, as Miriam introduced, I've been speaking in the last years from the collective knowledge of feminist political ecologies. I really don't believe in putting people into boxes. And one of the things I learned from joining academia is inevitably you get put into a box as you have to decide how your research is perceived. And at first I just said I'm a critical feminist who's looking at a whole range of things, but in academia you need to put yourself into some sort of description. So feminist political ecology became the description that I've used for myself. And it's something that I've done always collaboratively and with many different networks and different people, particularly this well-being, ecology, gender and community network, which has been funded by the EU to really look at how communities are creating well-being, are dealing with crises and are doing it from a gendered perspective, but also from an intersectional gender perspective, working with 15 PhDs around the world, connecting and thinking together. I've also been working with the degrowth movement, if one can call it that, people who are really concerned to sort of take the mainstream economy and look at the way growth cannot be at the center. And I've also been now doing it with a network called that is funded by Cross Action, which is looking at decolonizing in a pedagogical sense, development studies. So just to explain for those of you who are not sure what is feminist political ecology, essentially it looks at gender as a central social category that is shaping cultural, social and natural relations. So in that sense, it's not just focusing on women per se, but is looking at gender in an interrelated power relations from this intersectional perspective. So it's a complex way of explaining a very holistic sense of how the ways in which we are gendered is very related to both our society and both to the way the natural world operates. So it's a relational understanding of gender. But it's also, at least in the way in which I see it, it's part of a transition discourse. It's not about observing and analyzing and categorizing per se. It's actually something that is trying to use a way of seeing that allows us to bring about radical change. So in that sense, it fits, at least the way I'm perceiving it, as part of both academic discourse, but also political discourse, part of our individual way of how to live well, how to live with respect and understanding of others, and not only other humans, but other non-human beings, but also part of a collective struggle to transform unequal and unfair economic, social, and political systems. So for me, it's very important that feminist political ecology is not just seen as an academic way of understanding how ecologies operate or how politics operates, but is actually doing it in a way that tries to transform those systems, which of course makes it sit sometimes slightly awkwardly within academic discourse. At the same time, because it is within academia, it's also unpacking or looking at the ways in which science operates and the ways in which particularly environmental science operates and the ways in which environmental science is informing some of the, indeed, crises that have led to climate crises and to other environmental destruction. So in that sense, it's also critiquing science and critiquing the politics of science and asking in that critique that feminists are working with environmental movements and working with movements for change. In that sense, as I say, it's quite a complex, fluid and moving understanding of how we can look at how gender relations interacts with the ecological, the technological, and the political and economic processes. And it's doing so recognizing that often science, often economics is not capturing what feminists would see. So it's really trying to go to the heart of what is wrong in terms of the power relations in relation to also not only what is happening now, but also what has happened in the past in relation to colonialism. And at the same time, at least this is the way in which WeGo has been operating, we've been really trying to promote an ethics of care in terms of how to reimagine another form of economics, a post-capitalist alternative to neoliberal forms of natural resource-based development. So I hope that that captures as much as one can in a short moment, what is feminist political ecology? What you can hear from that is it's not a standalone group of people who are forming some sort of mini discipline. It's building from a whole range of feminisms. And I can't underline that more, that feminism for me is, there are multiple feminisms, but I think that particularly with feminist political ecology, as we've been in the WeGo network and in the other networks I've been working with in this last year and a half, really, because I feel like COVID has really demanded of me to think very differently from the ways in which academia invites you to be thinking and writing. But it's also important to embrace what is outside of the traditional academic understanding of political ecology. And this is where I, in a sense, unashamedly say that feminist political ecology is building from ecofeminisms. Why I say unashamedly is because there's been a lot of tension around how one can understand the links of environment, women, and the ways in which it's being seen as women are somehow closer to nature, more able to save nature, have a special understanding just because of their femininity or their female body or some essence of femaleness. These are things which have been critiqued within more academic discourses. But during COVID, and as I've been thinking through the importance of care, I can also see that we need to embrace and understand where ecofeminism comes from as a very important historical and cultural way of understanding gender relations. And to some extent, I'm now in a way embracing ecofeminism more, seeing these symbolic parallels between the oppression of women and exploitation of women and of nature. I think there's a room for a discourse between ecofeminism and feminisms which have come from thinking such as political ecology. Because in many ways, ecofeminism, right from the beginning, really questioned the growth-based economic system and argued that sustainability and care is just incompatible with mainstream economics, and has questioned the primacy of economics as a strategy for achieving well-being, of capitalism as a strategy for achieving well-being, and really have always been searching for alternative models which they see are there, where the preservation of life is really the central objective. So what I'm also seeing now is the importance of being in conversation with peasant women's groups, with community groups. This is also what's coming out of WeGo, where women's understanding of nature and their knowledge of nature is seen as counter to the mainstream economic models, and as emphasizing the importance of sharing, of common goods, and of solidarity, and the need to listen to those sorts of knowledges and the kinds of community decision making which takes into account different gendered knowledge, and therefore safeguarding collective interests of the environment there, and also helps to give, which I think is, we've seen in COVID, the importance of giving priority to local and regional economies and environments, and to move away from the global market in order to really recover the importance of local production and local consumption. I think this is something that we can be learning, at least I should say I'm learning from ecofeminisms. As I said at the beginning, I'm also really listening and learning from histories and from post-colonial feminisms. As a white settler Australian with the sorts of privileges I have, this is about also learning some humility, understanding that the kinds of knowledges and the positioning that I have has to take, to some extent, a sidestep and to work in allyship with Black, Chicana, and lesbian feminisms who are really shifting away from the Eurocentric reference points that have seen other knowledges as underdeveloped or developing. So this is always complicated when, as feminists, we are positioning ourselves as subjects who have not been heard and need to be more vocal, need to be listened to. And in fact, listening to and learning from post-colonial feminisms, I'm realizing that I'm been learning, and I've been doing this, I think, for many years, but with some degree of success and less than others, in this search for a transcultural feminism that is based on a solidarity that is not colonialist, imperialist, or racist. And to me, that is a huge challenge to those people who are talking about being economists, because that's precisely the way in which the world is perceived, that knowledge is based on colonial, imperialist, and racist understandings of production and of the way the neoliberal economic system works, in the name of growth and in the name of development, which impacts all national economies. So for me, I'm also asking all of us to think through what kinds of critiques we can produce transculturally, where we are listening to other, not only the sort of those who can have the privilege to speak, and I'm aware of the contradiction here, and I'm speaking here to you, and I hope I'm trying to do it in a way that opens up the possibilities for many of us to speak, so that we can critique all the different forms of reproductive and productive social organization of the colonial and patriarchal systems of domination in a way that enables other knowledges to be heard, other histories to be heard that are not just the dominant white male patriarchal Eurocentric understandings of the economy. Again, I say that with huge contradictions in myself, because I actually come from a sort of line of economists within that tradition. So it's also unlearning your own privilege and trying to think that through in ways which are not then positioning yourself as a subject of the talk of that kind of challenge, but certainly trying to understand how we can challenge Western-centric knowledge, because though we might be facing the same crises, we're certainly not all doing it from the same position. And for me, that extractive model of economic development, which exploits people and nature, which is profoundly racist, patriarchal, and classist. And this is where I think decolonial feminism is extremely important in trying to help us to understand how colonialism really lies at the core of exploitative society and nature relationships and reproduces gender and racial inequalities. These are things that I'm really, again, thinking and learning and being part of dialogues really that enable me to really, in a sense, put to one side the assumptions that I have, but doing so, as I said, in a form of allyship and in a form of trying to hear the many different kinds of voices. So one place, one position which I found myself able to do that from in a comfortable way is trying to be part of the feminist degrowth discussions, which has been more centered in Europe at the it's sort of coming out of European uncomfortableness, discomfort with the exploitation that has allowed we can enjoy, and try to really think through what kinds of new communities, what kinds of relationships we can build that allow for care for the earth, for the planet, and for each other. And this is really not so much academic discussion there, but I think it's really an envisioning of a possibility. And in a sense, for me, degrowth is not speaking for a way of being, but it's really speaking for something that could become, because it's trying to envisage just, sustainable, and convivial societies of societies brought about by voluntary change by people. And in that sense, it's really rooted in collective decision making, both in terms of the production and reproduction of common and public wealth. And I think for me, why I'm engaging in degrowth discussions is because it does take on board feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial theories as an integral part of its reasoning in order to challenge the reproduction of patriarchal and colonial continuities, and really works towards a transformation or transitions to another way of being, which disrupts gender injustices and colonial continuities. So these are the sort of foundations of the ways in which I'm asking us to engage in a thinking of care, because for me, care is really one of the most important human needs and activities. Yet, as I said, it's been completely ignored by political discourses and the economic reductionism of development. So in that sense, the feminist economics of care, I should say I don't, as I said, I position myself as a feminist political ecologist rather than an ecologist rather than an economist. But for me, I am learning from feminist economics of care that we really need to be critical of the privatization and individualization of social services under neoliberalism, and really look for public policy of care, and to understand that care needs, if we take care as a central value, we need to break down this idea that there's production and reproduction, but see them as both integral to the economy and to the good life, and to see that in order to address the economic crises, we have to bring a caring economy into the core of our economic values and embed it in the principles of cooperation and sharing, of reciprocity, and this idea of intersectional environmental justice. So for me, that means that we shouldn't be talking about something like greening the economy, but rather about sustaining livelihoods in a much more holistic way. For me, that is also taking up the notion of care, not as just a descriptor, but as an active thing to be doing. So care as reparative, And this is taken from Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who actually, in her book in 2017, argues that we need to refocus on care so that we see care as really virtually changing everything that we're doing. So that on one level, care is a deeply gendered and time-consuming activity. So very much what we're doing in the everyday, performed to support the bodily, emotional, and relational integrity of a human and more than human beings, but also to see care as an ethical and political concept. So to recognize that care is at everything we do to maintain and continue to repair our world. And for me, this deeper vision of care allows us to recognize our mutual interdependency and the very need to care for our sustainable and flourishing relations, which are about this sense of hope for the future, not merely about surviving or instrumental understandings of care. So for me, this idea of care as reparative is a very powerful way of understanding relations of care as at the center of our material and physical processes that sustain ecosystems and our human relations and our more than human living worlds. So for me, that's a very core concept of care that I think can help us put it at much more at the center of the ways in which we're going to be living together in the future. Another important understanding of care then is of care as a species activity. And here I'm building from Joan Tronto's work, where, as she stated, care is an essential part of human life, whether one relies on it in the broadest definitions or upon more narrow ones. We can see care as a way of providing the needs for others, but also as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So a species activity, the ways in which humans are being together, but also how they reach out and relate to others. So that includes caring for our bodies, ourselves, our environment, and as what she describes as this ways in which we are weaving a complex life-sustaining web. Now, this web of care is always contextual, and we need to understand it in its different settings. But for me, again, building on the idea of care as reparative, but also care as a species activity, we shifted away from seeing care as somehow invisible to the economy, but rather as an essential need and activity that we are doing that is something that we can really move forward in all sorts of academic and political processes. So another way of thinking through care, of understanding what are all these processes of care, which we can find in all sorts of scholarly fields, but also taking from Stefania Barker's work focus on reproduction, which she published last year. I think one of the most beautiful ways that we can actually weave together ecological, decolonial, and class and species perspectives of care is by listening to stories and the search for what she calls narratives of justice. She invites us to learn from peasant, Afro-descendant, mestizos, and indigenous groups who are at the forefront of the anti-extractive resistances across the world. And I really have taken a lot of heart again and a lot of hope from the way Stefania is asking us to look at the tool of narrative justice as a project of telling the other than master stories, so the non-mainstream stories of human habitation of the earth, as a way to really learn about how we can transform our understandings of care. So I think for me, this is really about listening, learning, and bearing witness to the many, many stories of how we care, how people's cares. And I wanted just to read from Irena Watson, who is a First Nations person, who is living in South Australia, actually in the town where I was born, and who is the First Nations professor of law. And in terms of listening and learning and bearing to witness, we need to listen to the natural world constantly. Now it is changing, howling, raining and drying up. We need to continually monitor dangerous extractive industries which might damage our natural ecosystems. First Nations have never stopped watching and acting. The non-Indigenous world needs to learn how to reciprocate and share the responsibility we have to the natural world. Perhaps it begins with some deep listening to the Indigenous world. So that is acknowledging the types of wisdoms that we can learn from First Nations people. So I also wanted just to briefly, I've got two more topics I'd like to cover about the importance of how we can center care in this way of listening, learning and bearing witness and thinking through care in a different way. I think that it's really important that by centering the concept of care, we can then start to build societies based on a commons of caring relations away from growth. So this is really taking up the importance of degrowth as a way to think about how to live well together and how to live on our finite earth with enough, with understanding that we have a sufficient amount of consumption of food, water, energy, resources, and atmosphere. So for me, the degrowth invitation is to see care and the reparative notion of care as a way to take into a new way of living together, where we need reciprocity, love, and accountability and care as the tools, rather than economic growth, consumption, and exploitation of the earth. And I think these sorts of tools are the ways in which we can face the uncertain futures and really try to move away from the sort of end game of what COVID is pointing us towards. And I think that's what's very important. And if I could just interrupt, I'm watching as we are speaking, I'm watching the sea and watching whales move across from the south to the north of Australia. And I've learned that these sorts of sightings and connections with nature also give me a sense of hope. So I feel like the whale has, just as it's come up now and is breaching, has also given me a sense of connection already to break my idea of, speaking to you through the internet, through these technologies, and just look out to the sea and acknowledge the presence of the whales and the ways in which those whales are traveling through this earth. And these were whales that were almost extinct, and are now, there are something like 34,000 of them now able to travel. They're moving up to give birth up in the north of Australia. But this is a sort of thing that I want to start acknowledging now, much more the connection we have with where we are and the connection where we have with other beings. And it's important to learn about this ability to really see where we are and to face the present, knowing the past and knowing the possible futures with care, and tending to those sorts of relationships, which carry across in different ways, I think, than the technological and the economic, but really try to listen to the kinds of stories and the kinds of meanings that we have just by being together and being in this particular time, these times of challenge, and learn to be inspired by a kind of emerging acknowledgement of, for example, me being able to give a talk to you here on Zoom, and yet also able to look across and be acknowledged by the whales. I'm trying to learn to hear that those things have meaning as well, those connections have meaning as well. And we need to be shifting our sense of the rational to acknowledge the spiritual and to acknowledge other beings as a way to care for people and communities and the environment together. So as I said, I'm in conversation with many people, and we're all working through these difficult times, as Miriam set out right at the beginning of these conversations. And for me, I'd invite you also to continue these. I think we've got many spaces. That's one of the interesting things about the COVID times. We've connected in many different ways through the internet, through Zoom, with all of its contradictions. But still, I wanted to mention this moment that I've been working towards for 2 years now with a group of 40 or so people, this Caring Communities for Radical Change, which will be the 8th International Degrowth Conference, which will be held in The Hague, but of course will be held online in the same way that I'm in Ecuador, but I'm actually sitting in Sydney speaking to you. So this Caring Communities for Radical Change is really highlighting care as a central concept through solidarity and justice as central to degrowth. And it's a collective project which is promoting sustainable decolonial feminist and post-capitalist modes of flourishing. It's a very exciting project which is building on many, many different conversations. And some of the questions that we're asking here, and I hope that, I'm sure that in the IAFFE conference next week, you'll also be talking through many of these kinds of concerns, but how to confront the contradictions between the pursuit of endless economic growth and the ecological boundaries of our planet. What kind of society can we build to ensure a good life for all without wealth and power being hoarded by the few? How can we enable a just transition that halts over-extraction, overproduction, and overconsumption? So for me, that's just the sets of conversations that we're really trying to work towards. So lastly, I just wanted to mention the importance of listening to the pluriversal. The pluriversal, of course, is not the universal, but it's a very difficult concept for us to take on board with real sincerity, in the sense that it's one thing is to say we cannot ignore the past and the impact of neoliberal capitalism and modern development that's based on deeply colonial and racialized relations. But at the same time, that particular imaginary, that particular way of understanding is deeply within us. The fact that we are speaking together, or I'm speaking to you through the computer in English, we're doing translation, it's we have connections from all over the world, is because of this particular form of knowledge has produced these connections. And these connections have erased other knowledges and ways of living with nature. And yet here we are needing these sorts of technologies, needing these ways of connecting to one another. So although this type of knowledge that allows these connections, that allows economies to continue, that as I speak, again, I'm looking out, there's a huge ship moving across the horizon, bringing goods from across the world. We know that that's where most of the goods are coming from. It's probably traveling up to Singapore. But these are also the contradictions, as the whales still there, still breaching, and the ships. So there's this very narrow way of understanding what is the ways in which the world works, but it's there, and it's something that we need to take into account. We have to acknowledge that these kinds of ways of living, ways of being are coexisting, have come from different paths, have come from many contradictory needs and desires. And I think that sort of messy and complex sets of relationships is what we need to really look through and to understand, not just to present there's this way now, but rather to see how can we, while pushing back against the dominant narratives, how can we actually work with those pluriversal understandings and come to a way of speaking across differences in allyship. And really, that means understanding, yes, there are those who are consumed and those who are doing the consuming. How can we change those relations? And how can those living with privilege rediscover how to transcend the kinds of privileges and the lies of economic development, learning to listen to those who live with loss. And I think COVID has showed us how those losses are felt multifold by people who are not part of that privilege. We don't need to go in those discussions, but it's just underlying that very much. So how do we recenter the hegemonic narrative and recover the capacity to relate with life without losing the sense of how we can move forward together? So while we need to challenge dispossession and the devaluing of life, how do we work towards repair and amplify solidarity and not reproduce mastery? So to me, that means really changing our ways of thinking, our desires, our habits and ways of being, and build these new relations of care, and to find common responsibilities of care, which is both political and substantive, and recognizes the intersectional oppressions that have arisen from what has been called, what is disaster capitalism, that has led to destruction of our earth. But at the same time, while we bring this awareness to the table, we can disrupt gender injustices and colonial continuities that shape these kinds of capitalist society nature relations. So I think that by valuing care, by recognizing care and being able to speak about it and being able to act on it, we can really help to displace and expose the kinds of crises which have led to climate change and environmental destruction, and to the pandemic such as COVID. So I think, as Miriam said, and as I've said, and it's really taken from a colleague and friend of mine, Giovanna Di Chiro, who's also part of the WIGO network and a wonderful scholar, that we need to revalue care and revalue caring for the earth and caring for people. But that means really centering the concept of care to build societies based on a commons of caring relations, away from growth and towards well-being and equity. So I think that this idea is that we need to really take stock, not continue to sort of chip away at mainstream economic thought or mainstream ecological thought, but actually recognize that we need to get beyond that mainstream discourse, because it really takes away our capacity for imagining and caring for other worlds, and for this process of recuperating past, presents, and futures. So while we need to recognize the inequities of gender relations and how they're embedded in colonial histories and they erase marginal women's bodies, voices, and knowledge, we need to reclaim those voices at the same time, and to reclaim plural histories and diverse cultural meanings. So I think I'm going to just end by explaining what I've been showing you in this PowerPoint, this fairly unsophisticated PowerPoint. I've been showing you embroideries, or the aparillas, which are sewn collectively by peasant women. It began in Chile, and it's also moved to Brazil and to other places in Latin America. It's showing the impact of modern development on their lives, of modern economic development, how the dams that have flooded their home, about dislocations, about the injustices. I've learned about the aparillas through the Brazilian scholar, and I was privileged enough to be working with her when she did her master's thesis, Tamara Ruzanski, who works with women in people's movements against dam. And her study focused on these embroideries and what they tell about everyday resistance of these women who have been invisible and marginal to the global and national discussions of development, which has rationalized the harnessing of nature for humanity's needs, destroying people's lives in the name of modern progress. So I've been showing you these really small resistances that speak to our imagination and to the possibilities of transitions, to the possibility of other knowledges, as we learn to listen to the polarity of people of color, of women, of marginalized people's experiences and imaginaries from a position of what I would like to call radical hope. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to Wendy from our side for this really actually inspiring talk, which has shared hope in these difficult moments. So this is really great. And thanks for sharing this search. I always understand that we are looking for paths together and exploring and experimenting. And as you said, there is one very important dimension to that, which is making visible all those modes of living, communities, practices that already do exist and that are systematically made invisible through, for example, the development discourse, because they are tackled and categorized as underdeveloped or as poor or as primitive or as only local or as irrelevant or whatsoever. And then there is this huge challenge that we face to really engage in the paths of transformation. What you said about the learning from other knowledges and everything really resonates very much with the discussions we're having here, both in feminist circles, in anti-extractivist circles, in ecologist circles, and especially in those who try to bring all of those together, also with the decolonial thinking. And I think something I have learned recently is that in the defense and recognition of other knowledges, there is this dimension, especially if we're talking of indigenous knowledges, to conserve them so they don't get lost, which is actually very important. But at the same time, it somehow fixes them in time as something old, residual, which is still there. And I think the real challenge is to put them into circulation and to solve, in order to be able to contribute to solve concrete problems in the present. And I feel this is something that has been really challenging now during COVID, because lots of indigenous communities here, for example, have put together their own remedies to prevent, to strengthen the body. There are lots of recipes coming around, but the real dialogue of knowledges, the spaces where this can take place, are really a hard thing to build. Like, how do we build spaces of dialogue where we can talk in an even way, where there is not this hierarchy of the academic or now the scientific and the Western medicine, and So I think this is a very big challenge. I would like you to maybe share some ideas of what can we do so that Indigenous peoples at the climate conferences don't only get 1 minute to talk, but that we really learn to listen, because and that this knowledge really can transcend to the realm of decision-making in some way. I don't know if I mean the realm of politics, because I don't know if this would already frame the decision-making in a certain way. And yeah, this leads me to my next reflection, that there is also a certain temptation to understand those I would call them buen vivir communities from my perspective here, like all the peasant communities, the women's communities we are now looking at, because they have this practice of putting care at the center, of putting the life at the center and the reciprocity. But the question is, how do they survive in the middle of the modern capitalist world? How have they survived so long without being absorbed by it? And how do they interrelate with that world, but still resist? Because they are not disconnected. There are lots of links, let's say. And what elements of modernity maybe also help them to survive and to be still there? And how can we, as more urban women and in a very urban continent like Latin America, where almost 80% of people live in cities, overcome this sort of fixation on rural alternatives and rural worlds, because I think there is an urgency to translate and to begin to practice community and care and this sustaining life also in urban contexts. I'll leave it there. I have two more for you if you want, but I think that's okay for a beginning.
Oh, thank you very much, Miriam. Yeah, these are all well, extremely important things that we have to be thinking through. I think in terms of other knowledges, one of the things that I'm asking us and myself to do is not just to sort of add in the idea that, yes, there's this sort of other, yes, as you say, residual knowledge or some sort of culture from the past, which somehow happened there and is not actually growing and thriving and is part of our world here. I think that that's the difficult thing, is to create that space. And it's not just in politics, in a UN convention or in a climate convention. I think it's in our everyday. I mean, in that sense, it's about how do we ourselves shift our understanding of how we're learning. So, for example, the ways in which we're teaching in academia, how do we stop the idea that there are, or at least shift the ways in which we're sharing knowledges, so that one thing that I have learned from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders practices of a yarning circle, of taking time to listen and hear who are you with, and from where do they come, and from which language do they speak, and what is their knowledge that they're bringing to the table. So I think it's also to shift this idea of that there's some universal correct way of understanding environments or understanding economies, and actually stop and listen to hear that actually there are many ways of acting as, you know, from a community perspective, economies. And in that, I've learned a lot from the community economies research network, which J.K. Gibson Graham in a sense founded, but has, in the spirit of, I think, how we should be, has simply opened up and linked up to many people who are then networked through this idea of community economies, which is a very radical take of post-capitalist ways of understanding economies as being grounded and based in community, and not to see it as some sort of side thing, but to say that is actually the core thing. It's not capitalism, but they have a famous iceberg diagram where you have, you know, the formal and then the informal below. And if you take that seriously, then we really have to switch the ways in which we then are learning and what sorts of spaces we create. I think it is a dismantling, I know with the tools that we have, but the sort of master's house or whatever, this is where these ideas of narratives of justice that Stefania Barker has invited us to do also is very inspiring for me. But that means putting a bit of a stop to how we're racing through everything and just imagining that the answer is going to be that we do a 3-year project and then this is all going to happen. So I think it is about slowing down and recognizing different languages are needed here. And not, I don't just mean English or Spanish, but really naming and understanding that there are many processes which have led to where we are now, and it's not just capitalism. There are many different things that are going on, and we need to bring those out. That would be my reflection back to you in terms of the non-development discourses and how powerful they are, and how we need to be listening and working with them and creating dialogues that are very different. That's why I use the Aparilas as speaking to us in different ways, right? Then a sort of neat case study of how people have been displaced by dams, and you know, we sort of can do it that way, but we can also very powerfully hear and be moved by the kind of art really that these embroideries enable us to see what is happening in those terms, which are very different from the economic, sociological, anthropological ways of positioning people. So I guess that to me is also a little bit about the idea of we can't just say modernity doesn't exist, capitalism doesn't exist. It does, but we are part of it, and we therefore can change it, right? To me, that's what's important, that we don't have to, there are no rules as such in the sense that we are making these rules. I guess this is a sort of Foucauldian notion of power, but I think it's not really, it's what I have see in my life. People will, if you believe in the sorts of ways of connecting and thinking about differences and really respecting them, then I think we can shift these sorts of absolute hierarchies. And to some extent, as you said at the beginning, Miriam, COVID has shown what a mess we're in a very powerful way across the world. So this is the moment to really try to get people to see that we need to change the economic and political frameworks we're in. But it's not about resistances, it's about living and working through it. If you see what I mean. I think resistance is not a helpful thing, because we're all living now with a virus, which is part of us. We're living with capitalism, which is part of us. There's no pure something absolute outside, right? We're having to understand how those things connect. And I think feminisms have helped us do that all the time, because at least for me, and maybe this speaks to my generation, as a feminist, I needed to be able to understand that I was part and parcel of a society that was not listening to me. And I think that's the thing that we recognize. We're part of it, but we can then, with our voices and with our different ways of thinking, shift it. And so now I'm also seeing the need to make that more and more pluriversal, rather than continuing to say, let's just add in this voice or add in this. And that to me is what intersectional justice is speaking about. I hope that, I mean, really important questions which we can't solve, but I think these are the sorts of things we need to push ourselves to be taking very seriously, even to the point of questioning, why are we, you know, as academics here, what are we teaching and what are we writing about? How can we break open these sorts of universalizing ways of, this is economics, this is anthropology, this is sociology? How do we really say, no, there are stories here that need to be brought together and need to be thought through from very many different perspectives, and take the time to think, how do we do that? Not just to build new models or new I don't know, sort of disciplines or something. It's, to me, that's also very important. I'm speaking here in our capacity, I think, as teachers and as people who are part of a university, which even itself, university, right? As opposed to pluriversity, yeah.
Yeah, I very, very much agree with that. We also face that challenge in this new masters. We had planned to include I'm talking about the masters about political ecology and alternatives to development, which started last year. And it started right with the pandemic. So all the nice field trips we had planned to take students out of university and into the communities, and to, yeah, just have those dialogues just had to be readapted to the virtual format. But well, yeah, I have a colleague in Colombia, Tatiana Roa Vendaño is her name, who stresses very much, and I think this is very related to Colombian specific history, that every process of resistance always contains the other world, the emerging new, the other kind of relating. So she would defend resistance as a site of production of alternatives. I don't know. And she actually demonstrates that in her work, like for the new to emerge and for the relations to be able to build in another way, you also have to protect space against constant aggression of commodification or dispossession or whatever. What would you do with that?
So this is where, yeah, context is really important, and also the position from which you're speaking. So this is where I would be saying I'm listening and learning from from that, because for me, I see, of course, the painful erasures and the resistances that are very needed, and the obviously whole cultures, people's health. Even if you look at what's happening in COVID, so many people, particular people, were the ones that have died from COVID, and others who have survived because of those huge inequalities and ways our society is organized that privileges some and others. So clearly that, of course, resistance has to be there, in that resist, but then also build from that as well. I totally respect that and understand that that's something that we see that in histories. I think for me, what is important though is that there's not a sort of black and white a resistance, and therefore then we go like a sort of praxis. To me, it's much more complicated and difficult to it's not just capitalism versus the proletariat, for example. I think we're moving from that sort of Marxist tradition of understanding. It's not just women versus men. I mean, these dualities, I think that's what to me is very important, and resistance seems to indicate that. So resistance is in different ways, in different levels, in different scales. Yes, I totally agree with that. And that's also very important to recognize. To me, the question would be, back to you perhaps, is also how do we remove the sort of anthropocentric notion of how we bring about change, and thinking, because it's as if we're always, it's always the human as the agent. So to me, that's also a challenge that we have right now, is how do we give the more than human, the non-human, if you like, the sense of agency, and recognize that in our understanding. And to me, that's a huge challenge to science and to economics, because we don't acknowledge that in terms of economic science anyhow. The resources are there to be taken and there to be used for the benefit of humanity. And that's to me something which is we can learn from Indigenous First Nations peoples, because they don't see things in that division. I don't know what you think. I'm not sure. I don't understand all of the chat questions or
we will
comments.
take them right now, yes. And actually, I would like to invite all the people who still want to pose a question or also share a comment to do that now. That would be the moment. I lost the point. Can you just give me one word, what you were saying before?
It was, how do we understand agency?
The anthropocentric, yes, sure. I think this is, this is the privilege of living in the global south as a migrant, as it is my case, because I'm originally German, and maybe it's one of the reasons why I decided for it at some point, because here the sense, the possibility of having reciprocal relations with the surroundings is still more present, maybe. What I found in the territorial implementation of Wendy Harcourt I was working about in the last years is that the relation to these surroundings, as many indigenous communities call it, they don't speak of nature, but just of this is our surroundings and we depend on them, that it's very pragmatic, but in this pragmatism there is a huge dimension of care. I need you and you need me, and so we care for each other, And there is this woman who plants trees only for the birds because they have some fruit that she doesn't need, but the birds do need them. And I was really impressed how simple and how pragmatic often this relationship is, which is departing from a non-anthropocentric position. And this made it much easier for me to say, okay, so let's try that. Let's try to relate in this way. Yeah, but I think we now should take some questions from the public. So here we have Yvonne Quintana, who is asking, Heather, I'm going to do this in Spanish. Buenas tardes para todos. Quiero saber cómo iría reforzando esta economía feminista con la seguridad alimentaria en nuestros países. I think we can still do it one by one. It's okay. So Wendy.
Okay, yeah. So what I heard was that the importance of understanding food security. So I think that goes to understanding a shift from global economy to local economy, and being able to or to regional economies, and to be able to from a feminist political ecology perspective, being able to question that people are having to grow food for for consumption elsewhere, and to change the ways in which people can sustain their livelihoods, which I think would build on a very different system of local and regional economies. I know that, for example, in the SWIGO project, looking at how many communities are able to sustain themselves, but because of extractivist economics, because of the ways in which it's considered, I mean, people have to be growing for cash. There's often, maybe again, context is important, but let's say in Ghana, which I've been sort of looking at with students in northeast Ghana, where there's climate change has led to desertification of the area. So local food produce is not enough for survival. So people are burning trees for charcoal, is leading to a whole range of practices which is not enabling food security. That needs to shift so that people are not being pushed into a sort of long global chain, really, of producing certain products for the market, and then that moves them away from being able to sustain their livelihoods. So we need to shift so that food security for that those villages are the important ones, and that is about economic policy, a government policy to also provide, I think restoring really the ways in which people were living before. Very, very complicated to do. But I think feminist political ecology, by looking at these contextualized smaller areas, is trying to build up that picture of this is where communities and regional food is very important. It has to move away from the huge global demands. But at the same time, it should be that in Europe or where I'm, Australia or wherever, that we're also have to break down the idea that we can go to the supermarket and just buy anything at any time. So it also means a shift of care for our own environments as well, the kind of damage that supermarkets do to our own lives. So it's a complicated one. It's on both levels. Feminist political ecology looks at those different scales, beginning from the everyday and then building up to the local, to the global. So you see how there are very reciprocal relations there. I hope that's not a particularly brilliant answer, but we are, for example, putting together some studies that look at both what's happening for peasant communities and what's happening for urban communities in terms of needing to change their relations to food and their relations to each other. So it's not just looking at what food is produced and where does it go, but also the ways in which people are relating to food, are relating to cultures of food, and how they're connected to one another from the urban and the rural. So I think that's the way feminist political ecology looks at it. It's not an economic look at it. It's a way in which there are relations being built up around food at different levels and at different scales. I hope that answers to some extent the question.
Certainly. Okay, the next question is about the woman-nature relationship. Me parece que el ecofeminismo es una de las aristas desde donde buscamos soluciones al problema más importante, que es el tema de la degradación del medio ambiente y del cambio climático. Profesora Wendy, ¿está de acuerdo en que existe una simbiosis entre la mujer y la naturaleza? ¿Existe una relación vital?
So yes, I was saying in my talk that I recognize that ecofeminism and the ways in which people have looked at how women are have a particular relationship to the natural environment is something to recognize. But I think as a feminist political ecologist, I would say that's not a natural one. It's one that is a cultural, a social one, an economic one that we can look at and therefore recognize that it's not just because you're a woman. I think that's extremely important because I also, in the same way that I question dualities of difference, I'd also say there are men and women in different understandings and that there are also people who are in between. I think that's something that in many cultures you recognize that there are peoples who are not necessarily relating to just being a man or just being a woman. So the whole issue of allowing for different understandings of your gender is extremely important. And that's why I'm careful about saying there's a woman's relationship to nature. I think there's a gendered relationship to nature, which different types of bodies take up in different forms. And these bodies are not necessarily male or female as such, but certainly they're gendered and they are embodied and they are sometimes very close because of the social and cultural understanding of that closeness. That can be felt very deeply, very spiritually, but it's not necessarily to do with being a woman or a man. I think it's to do with the ways in which we read gender on bodies and then read that onto country or onto place or onto the forests or onto the seas or whatever. So I'm very careful about that, but I recognize the importance of saying that there's sort of not humanity here and nature here. There's much more symbiosis in that sense, but it's not necessarily related to being a woman or a man or something in between.
Okay, now we are getting more questions, so I'm going to give you two together. The first one is from Lily, and it says, is there any difference in considering caring as a common from considering caring as a public good? Wow, very good question. And the second, let me just read it out to you. This is from Silvia Vega, and I will switch to Spanish. ¿Es lo mismo conceptualmente la economía del cuidado y la economía feminista? Al hablar de economía feminista del cuidado, ¿esto significa que hay otra economía del cuidado no feminista?
Yeah, okay, these are great questions. I feel very challenged here. I think that for me, caring in terms of commons is a much more radical statement than caring as public goods. I think it's evoking, if you use the language of commons, a much more holistic understanding that it's not just about the economy, it's about the environment, and it's about the relations of people with the environment and with each other. So it's relations of care when you talk about commoning. And it's also a political notion of sharing across different types of beings, if you like. I mean, to me, commoning is a very radical concept of also acknowledging the agency of the non-human other, and also acknowledging very different understandings of uses of resources, which are not necessarily Western-centric. Whereas caring and public goods is very much within a Western framework of understanding goods as something that you acquire as public or as a private good, and that yes, it's got its place in the sense that it's challenging within the mainstream framework, the hegemonic framework, the notion that you can care can be something that can be governed, that can be administered, that can be put into the economic framework that we are trying to make more distribution better for different groups of people, allow for care for the it's a public good that you can administer for all of your citizens, but a very different type of thinking in terms of this is a much more, might be very progressive developmental thinking, whereas I think commons is a much more environmentally rooted, much more radical sense of how we can have to rethink the ways in which we do care. So I see them as two different frameworks which maybe can speak to one another, but they're speaking from very different contexts. That's to me the challenge we have right now, because public goods is speaking to a very economistic language, and commoning is speaking to a much more environmentalized, holistic understanding. So we need to look at how they can speak to one another, and certainly how, as Miriam quite rightly said, how do we bring that thinking of caring and commoning into the bigger democratic space, and that's something that where public goods is already. So maybe that's an interesting conversation to have, but a really good question. Yeah, great question about, is there something other than a feminist economy of care? Yes, of course there is. I mean, again, it's the same sort of answer to the idea of public goods. It's the one that is pretty invisible. It's the one that people are talking about care work, and are thinking about how does one pay for care work? How does one allow a proper value for care work? So that's where you acknowledge that there's need for example, there are care homes for older people in different parts of the world. There are domestic workers coming from the rural to look after people in the urban environment. This is all care that can be monetarized and needs to be fairly understood as work, etc. There's also in that sense, that is not necessarily a feminist understanding of the economy of care. That is a gender-aware understanding. It's certainly been brought in by feminist economists who've worked hard to make visible that kind of care work. I can think of many studies of that, but to me that's a much more mainstream understanding of what is care, that is monetized, put into the system. Nancy Fulber, who cares for the kids, all of this is important and necessary, but it's not what I'm talking about when I talk about the different feminisms of how one thinks about care. It's much deeper, and it's really pushing us much harder in trying to say, let's look at care not within this economic framing.
Great. Karin Schönpflug has also a challenging question. A lot of what is being said here has already been part of the models presented in feminist utopian literature of the second and even the first wave of the women's movement. With the time window of counteracting against global warming closing, how can we epistemologically transcend the dominant economic structures fast enough? She says, my young students are seriously thinking about environmental movements going into armed revolution. This is not what I am teaching. And then one more, please, because to try to get them all. This is from someone called Carmen. I am curious if there is a feminist political ecologist critique of feminist economics, points of difference or contention.
Okay, great questions. Thank you for picking them out, Miriam. Yes, I totally agree with the first one, that as a teacher in the last 10 years, where you do feel that there's a sort of repetitiveness of what utopian feminisms have been saying, what Ursula Le Guin has been writing about many of these issues. I think the sense of urgency and the window, as you put it, is closing. But that's exactly why I've been working also not only as a teacher but as an activist, always trying to think about, well, what is the possibility now? And this is where I'm talking to the degrowth movement, because I think they're bringing out many of the things that I've been speaking about, writing about, acting about. I don't know which wave I'm meant to fit into, but certainly for me, it's something that we are still trying to go deeper and deeper. To some extent, I think the revolution, I mean, I was in the 80s out on the streets trying to talk about rape in war and about stopping uranium mining. These were my issues, my context, my history. These were similar. These were things that I was doing then. I think students now are out on the streets talking about climate change and doing it very differently than I was doing. And I think as an older person, another generation, is to connect those histories and to not see them as somehow failures, but to say these were the moments in which we were struggling with this. These are the things we came up with. Of course, I also was at the UN thinking in the 1992 at Rio that this was going to be how we could save the world. Completely disillusioned. And I think, like you, perhaps, I need to step back, take another space and say, yeah, maybe this call for revolution is what is needed now. I don't have answers. I'm only trying to say we can't deny the past or say, oh, it was all done before. Of course, we were doing things differently then. Of course, these were the same concerns, but we need to be listening. And that's what I was trying to say, trying to listen to other voices. And that's part of the generational stepping back and listening to what it is that students need to do. And to recognize that my role or our role as, if I'm speaking to those of you who are teachers, we have to teach differently and acknowledge the sort of practices that need to happen. And good if people are thinking about different revolutions. I mean, that's why I'm part of the degrowth discussions, because I see that is a place where students feel they can do something. Younger people feel they can do something, and I can as well. I'm not sure if that was answering you. I'm not afraid of the idea that we are still working with these issues. I am afraid that the window is closing, but I'm still not giving up hope. That's my sense of radical hope, I think. Okay, feminist critique, yeah. The book that Christine Bauhart and I edited, we were trying to speak to the contradictions between feminist politicology and feminist economists. I don't know if we succeeded, we're still continuing that dialogue, but certainly it's about saying that you cannot ignore environmental concerns in economics. And at the time, there have been many times, I think for the last 20 years, where I find to my astonishment that economists don't see the environment, don't see people as part and parcel of their discussions in ways which I find deeply distressing, because I think that's also part of the erasures. So that book tries to pick up some of those debates in different contexts between feminist politicology and feminist political economics. But it's a good question to do it more succinctly and more clearly, and something that I try to do at least in my teaching as well. So there are critiques there, particularly around environmental issues. I think that the people I was mentioning in my talk also are people who are critiquing feminist economists from an ecological, from a, if you like, anthropological perspective.
Thanks, Wendy. I would like to read out two beautiful comments and then move on to two other questions. Both comments are in Spanish. Soy Olga Montúfar, presidente de la Red de Mujeres Indígenas con Discapacidad. Les saludo desde México. Quiero compartir que me encanta escuchar a la panelista, porque si lográramos dar a cada persona lo que necesita, las mujeres indígenas con discapacidad no estaríamos bajo el estigma de ser una carga, sino que se valorará las contribuciones que hacemos al mundo. And the second comment, gracias, Wendy. Estoy en Sucumbíos, Ecuador. El año pasado desapareció la cascada de San Rafael, la más bonita de Ecuador. De hecho, se derrumbó por un proceso de erosión causado por una hidroeléctrica. Pero también, y no sabemos en qué medida, los indígenas ya dijeron que no podía construirse esta hidroeléctrica porque el monte se lo había dicho. pero no escucharon sus voces ni las de las personas que lo dijeron también. Dices, ¿de qué forma tenemos esperanza radical en este esquema? Para mí, la puerta para esta esperanza es en el llanto, como una forma de escucha. Llorar por la cascada, por la pérdida, por las injusticias. Me ha generado una reconciliación con la naturaleza, con la selva. Y el llanto ha añadido a mi solidaridad una dimensión humilde. Gracias por tu visión, que quisiera incorporar a lo que estoy escribiendo sobre ecofeminismos. Okay, thanks a lot for these comments. There are two questions on degrowth I will regroup. The one first is from a person called Carol. I'd love to hear your vision on the role of the state as an actor or not in a feminist degrowth society. The question considers the fact on the engendered relation of the state with power and hierarchy, and of these with a patriarchal structure. And the next one is, dear Wendy, thanks for clarifying your notions of care. I wonder how the non-formal, non-monetarized care work interferes or converges with the ideas of feminist care ethics within the degrowth perspective. Would you share your thoughts on the directions degrowth walks into towards a concept or an ethics of care? Thank you so much for this space.
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Great, very beautiful comments. I just wanted to acknowledge them. And also, if I could say that I think emotions and crying and listening in different ways to the not more than human other, the earth others, as Val Plumwood calls it, I think is also a very important part of our shift in the ways in which we can deal with the kind of crisis-ridden world we're living in. And I think not only that, I wanted to say that bringing that crying and that emotion into so-called political, mainstream political spaces is also very important. So I think the more, this is what the narratives of justice that Stefania Barker is talking about. I think the more we acknowledge this, acknowledge the emotions, acknowledging the cry, acknowledging the pain as part of our resistances and as part of the ways to change, to move away from the rational, the objective, the number crunching approach to how we can see what's going on in our world, the better. And that's again why I showed the aparillas, because this is acknowledging the pain and the erasures and the destruction that's caused by such a capitalocentric view of what is our economy. So I really welcome that. And I would also like to say that it's not therefore saying there's some separate space, but actually we need to bring it in. So for example, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is right now being fought for by First Nations people here with their allies in Australia, they are bringing in the pain and the crying and the sadness, a deep sadness about the destruction of the environment here and ways of life, right into the heart of political debate, but not being afraid to speak about the love in which they're doing it. So it's also to bring in emotions and crying as very key to shifting the ways in which we understand politics and the ways in which we need to move forward. So degrowth, the two questions. I think that, and I just want to acknowledge also disabilities and rethinking of bodies and what disabilities means. I think that's been a very important part of our acknowledgement as well of, again, this sort of questioning of what is wholeness and what is seen as the norm. I think these are also very important things to be challenging all of us. In terms of the state, I in degrowth and governance, I'm not someone who this is generational, I think. As a feminist who came into politics in the 80s, I didn't believe in the state. I was one of these people who thought that it should come from community, and that in many ways it was because the state was not listening to the sorts of issues. I was particularly involved in issues of domestic violence, as I mentioned, and also of uranium mining, these sorts of battles. And it was actually, we went to the international level to try to get those things heard. That's why I think I became more involved in international things. The state was not listening. That's not a good answer, but I think that that's also the degrowth movement is not necessarily, and Miriam will know probably, and others will have more to say about this than I do. But for me, I'm very much thinking with community and at the very local level, and then trying to also bring that to an international level. That's the way in which I've somehow seen how politics moves at different levels. I apologize in a way, but I've left the understanding of the state to others. I think that is because of the time in which I came into being a political feminist in that sense. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But I think degrowth also has some interesting things to say about where the politics is and whether the state is the place in which one has to act. In terms of the ethics, oh gosh, yeah, the ethics of care in relation to, sorry, the last question I've forgotten. I've just written down something about the ethics of care, but I'm not sure what that was about. Sorry.
Yeah, it's about how the non-formal, non-monetarized care work interfere or converge with the ideas of feminist care ethics within the degrowth perspective.
Yeah, I think that indeed in this degrowth conference, what we have found is that notions of care and the ethics of care are very different according to what perspective you're coming from. So as I think, and actually Miriam probably can answer this question better than I can, but for me, it's the idea of caring for different people, caring with people. So I think it's also breaking down the notion of what is care in relation to how we can think through caring with others, not just human others, but also non-human others. And I think to some extent, we move away from the feminist economists in that way by trying to broaden the notion of caring with the non-human others as well. I'm something indeed why I have become involved in the degrowth movement is because it challenged my notion of what is growth and how we can think very differently about growth in terms of being growing with many others around us and not just seeing the human as at the center of that. So I don't have a very good answer to that, but the ethics of care for me was about caring for not just the humans, but also the non-human others. And to me, that's still something of a challenge that I'm trying to work through in the degrowth perspective. For some reason, I find that question a very difficult one, and that's probably why, like all of us, why we belong or why we join discussion groups or people that help you think those things through. And I think that's really why I'm have found myself part of this degrowth discussion, because I'm still struggling with how does one do that.
Okay, I would like to end with 2 comments / questions from people from Latin America, so I'm going on in Spanish. En mi punto de vista, uno de los problemas que enfrentamos es que todos los acuerdos internacionales ambientales, incluyendo la Convención de Cambio Climático, son funcionales al modelo económico mainstream. El tiempo se está agotando y todas las propuestas que surgen no apuntan a un cambio de este modelo económico mainstream, que es el eje conductor del modelo de desarrollo global. Da la sensación de que ni la crisis de 2009, la crisis climática y la crisis planteada por la pandemia conducen a cuestionar el modelo de desarrollo dominante que se ha mostrado totalmente insostenible. ¿Cómo podríamos actuar buscando un cambio en este modelo económico mainstream? Necesitamos pensar un modelo de desarrollo donde la economía se sujete a las reglas o leyes ambientales y a la inclusión ambiental. This one was from Pierina Herman. And then we have one from Mirna Pacheco. Excelente charla. Saludos desde Playa del Carmen en México. En su opinión, las mujeres que se suman a las actividades turísticas rurales gestadas localmente, ¿puede ser un ejemplo para ser analizado desde la ecología política feminista? Pues al menos en el contexto del sur de México, yo lo percibo como un movimiento de resistencia suave por parte de las mujeres por integrarse a las actividades económicas lideradas principalmente por hombres y que ahora ellas quieren sumarse para tener voz en la forma del desarrollo de su región.
Well, thank you.
That would be our last questions.
Well, they're wonderful. In all of this, I think these are great conversations. Thank you to everybody for all the insights I'm glimmering from these kinds of questions. I think it's interesting that we're all struggling with similar things, and certainly for me, my hope, my radical hope, I think, is that we are actually moving towards a different understanding of what is environment, so that we're not parceling out economics, environment. We're seeing how interconnected they are, and also how humanity is also very interconnected to the more than human, and that we need to really radically rethink those relationships, so that indeed the economic model, the economic crisis, it's not an economic crisis or economic model, it's embedded within all sorts of worlds that we need to respect and understand differently, away from our human-centric perspective. But with our imagination and with our sense of hope, and with a recognition of the many different cultures that have lived for thousands of years with the environment. I mean, I'm speaking to you here from Australia, and I think that's one of the devastating things, is that you see how right now the First Nations people are saying, we're giving you this knowledge because we're going to lose all hope if we can't give you this knowledge, because we need to work together. We need to understand together the ways in which we need to change. So that for me, I mentioned in my talk, just because I was seeing, and I am seeing whales moving across, I'm looking across at the sea, and I've been seeing a kookaburra sitting on my veranda as I've been talking. I'm speaking from my brother's home. But these connections with the more than human others, we shouldn't be ignoring. We should be thinking, how do we not ignore those sorts of needs? So the whales that were dying out because of the whaling trade are now back from a few 3,000 to now 38,000. So it is possible to regenerate, to rejuvenate, to move away from the devastations. I think we still have to keep this radical hope that we can do that by combining our different knowledges from the, let's say, modern, and from the traditional, and from these past, present, and futures. I think this is a really important thing for me that I'm trying to learn about. And I think from the different contexts and perspectives, it's very important. So for me, that we're already breaking down. We know from the pandemic that the economic model pursued relentlessly has led to this huge health crisis, and we're recognizing now that we need to think very differently about how to change it, even if we're having to use modern medicines with the vaccinations, but we're I think we have to keep working on how to see those different worlds, how they can come together. This is for me the meaning of the pluriversal. We need to recognize that we can change the situation for the whales so that they can now flourish and continue to move to do, they're moving from south to north to give birth in the north of Australia, as I'm watching. I've seen many whales pass as I've been giving this talk. So I think that to me is important. We need to break down a little bit our rational way of thinking and try to see some of these connections in a little bit more slow way, learning from these things, and not to feel this sense of crisis is inevitable that we are about to end the world, but rather look at what are the possibilities and build on those sense of hope. And to me, that is what the degrowth movement is doing. And indeed, I think this is what we can learn from when we're talking about these soft resistances, thinking through how different knowledges around how one cares for the earth, about how one can be with each other, be in relationships with the more than human. We need to bring this into our feminist political economics or our feminist political ecology and think those things through together as part of a, if you like, soft resistance in solidarity with the women in Mexico who are doing this different kinds of tourism. I think there are multiple ways in which we can continue to work and be together, but we have to acknowledge that we do it by this sort of listening and by removing the sort of, if you like, Western-centric ways of understanding economy and understanding ecologies. I don't know if that's a very good note to end on, because I very much enjoyed the conversation, but I'm learning a lot from all of the questions and all of the comments that were given. And thank you so much for the translation. That I really appreciated. Also that we are working across all of these different languages and ways of seeing. And to me, that gives me also a lot of hope. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. I also really enjoyed this conversation with all of you. I also would like to thank Heather for this very demanding work of interpretation. I would like to thank all of you for joining from the different parts of the world. I extend now in public an invitation for Wendy to come here and to share some deeper moments of listening reciprocally and with those other knowledges. I hope this will be possible soon. And for being here with us today and sharing so openly and in such an enriching and reflexive way your learnings and questions and queries, which really have inspired us a lot, I think. So yes, we have got to the end of this talk. Take care, all of you, very much in these days, and until the next time.